Let's jump right into it. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking one of the most terrifying cosmic entities in modern grimdark lore. Put yourself in the shoes of a high sorcerer for a second. You've spent centuries, literal centuries, meticulously locking away all the chaos of the universe inside this impenetrable fortress known as the Jagged Spire. You think you're perfectly safe, right? Well, think again. Enter the Architect of Inkblot. This is an entity whose entire cosmic purpose is to absolutely wreck your carefully crafted, rigid history.
I folded your past into your future and tossed them both away into the laughing void. Man, that quote just hits hard, doesn't it? It perfectly captures the architect's mocking, totally paradoxical tone. Imagine being a high sorcerer, where your whole existence hinges on a strict, chronological A to B timeline. Hearing something like that would induce pure psychological terror. The architect is essentially the chronicler of what shouldn't be. It speaks in these wild, mind-bending paradoxes, treating the past, present, and future not like fixed laws of physics, but more like flimsy scraps of paper you can just crumple up and toss in the trash. Even the name, the architect, is a massive insult. It's a direct, mocking jab at the sorcerers who built the Jagged Spire, basically saying, your architectural marvel, it's absolute garbage compared to my reality-breaking power.
It's fascinating to look at the stark contrast between these two forces. On one hand, you've got the high sorcerers completely obsessing over static control. To them, history is this grand, perfectly ordered tapestry where every single thread is exactly where it belongs. And on the other hand, you have the architect. It represents the accidental spill. It's this volatile, chaotic timeline anomaly that's born the exact second fate tries to write itself too rigidly, causing reality to just fray and collapse. When the architect looks at that grand tapestry the sorcerers are so proud of, it doesn't see a masterpiece. No, it sees a sterile, blank piece of parchment that is practically begging to be ruined by a beautiful, unpredictable stain. It is the ultimate disruptor of rigid history.
So how does this thing actually manifest? The lore breaks it down into an anatomy of chaos, the silhouette of the spill, the fractured crown, and the bleeding presence. Just picture yourself standing on the battlements of the Jagged Spire, watching this thing approach. It doesn't even have a fixed form. What you see is a towering, shifting silhouette of liquid midnight, totally ringed by the blinding, iridescent starlight of high time. It's honestly less of a traditional monster and more like a wildly aggressive, living shadow that defies literally every natural law.
And crowning that liquid midnight silhouette is the second part of its anatomy, the fractured crown. It's this maddening halo of fractured clock faces and shattered hourglasses floating right above it. But they aren't just broken. They are actively running backward or just spinning at totally impossible speeds. Think about the sorcerers again. Their magic relies entirely on the steady tick-tock of chronological time. Looking up at that crown would literally shatter their minds. It's a visual representation of time itself having a violent seizure, completely mocking the very concept of tracking hours and minutes.
But the final aspect of the architect, the bleeding presence, is arguably the most terrifying. Wherever this entity steps, the ground doesn't just crack or crater like a normal giant beast just stomped on it. No, the ground literally dissolves into actual physical ink. And the horror goes way past property damage. This ink stains the history of that location, completely erasing the memories of whatever happened there before. Imagine the creeping existential dread those high sorcerers felt. They aren't just losing a battle, they are actively being deleted from history. The ground they stand on, all the legacies they've built, just dissolving into a meaningless black sludge.
Which brings us to a massive, fatal flaw in the High Sorcerer's ultimate stronghold, the Jagged Spire. They were absolutely convinced their prison was impenetrable. Why? Because they anchored it entirely to the present moment. They locked it down hard in the now. But they completely failed to account for high time. So how does the architect get in? It doesn't bother attacking the spire from the outside in the present day. Instead, a millennia of history is unwritten. The present becomes totally meaningless, and the attack actually bleeds backward from 100 years in the future, right into the now. The sorcerers built this massive wall in 3 dimensions, and the architect just casually walked around it in the 4th.
Okay, so let's break down the exact mechanics of how this escape, known as the spill, actually went down. It happens in 3 distinct phases: the catalyst action, the logic collapse, and the unsealing. Each of these steps is an absolute masterclass in cosmic horror, and they just compound the sorcerer's terrifying realization that their precious static control was nothing more than an arrogant illusion.
It all kicks off with step 1,
The catalyst action. Like we just talked about, the architect isn't laying siege with armies or catapults. It bleeds into the spire's reality from the future. It literally drops a single, massive blot of chaotic timeline directly onto the apex of the jacket spire. Think of it like dropping a heavy bead of black ink onto a crisp, dry piece of paper. The paper doesn't break, right? It absorbs the liquid, the fibers warp, and that pristine surface is irreparably corrupted. That one drop of chaos was the catalyst, introducing a fatal, reality-breaking error into the sorcerer's perfectly ordered world.
And that leads directly to step 2, which is really the crux of it all, the logic collapse. When that blot of chaotic timeline hits, it forces the spire to exist in a billion different moments at once. Imagine the absolute terror of the sorcerers trapped inside. The ancient, dusty stone of their fortress suddenly can't maintain absolute stasis anymore. It is simultaneously being newly built by masons, decaying into fine dust centuries in the future, and standing perfectly still in the present. Reality itself just crashes like an overloaded computer. The fundamental logic holding the atoms of the spire together simply collapses because matter just cannot obey infinite, contradictory commands all at the exact same time.
So we arrive at step 3, the unsealing, where everything builds into total devastation. The jagged spire was a cage, absolutely, but it was a cage made out of rigid logic, not just stone. And under the immense, crushing weight of those conflicting timelines, that logic cracks wide open. And what happens when a cage cracks? The prisoners escape. The entity known as the Small finds the very first microfracture in reality. The hunger consumes the terrified sorcerer's rapidly fading expectations of safety, and the Wit literally laughs the remaining paradoxical walls into dust. The impenetrable fortress doesn't fall to brute force, it falls to absolute absurdity.
Which naturally brings us to a really vital question. Why unseal the spire and free those terrifying entities, the spirit siblings, in the first place? You're probably asking this, just as those doomed, trembling high sorcerers definitely did in their final fractured moments. Was the architect trying to build an army? Was it trying to rule over the Small, the hunger, and the Wit like some kind of cosmic tyrant? Well, the answer is actually far more chilling, because it totally removes any sense of traditional rationality or conquest from the equation.
The answer is that the architect is simply the director of the show. It has zero grand political ambition. It didn't free the spirit siblings to rule them. It freed chaos purely to watch what happens when the living ink, those freed entities, meets the ultimate stain of its own presence. It is literally just doing this for the sheer aesthetic spectacle of entropy. It wants to see the rigid canvas of history burn in a beautiful explosion of unpredictability. Which leaves us with a truly chilling thought to end on. If your entire life, your beliefs, and your history were perfectly ordered, what will you do when the ultimate stain inevitably bleeds into your own carefully constructed reality? Think on that until next time.